Welcome to you who are here at Entrée this afternoon. Nice to see so many of you here, and welcome to those attending on Zoom. Welcome, Felipe Pena, calling in from Rio de Janeiro today, and thank you so much for accepting my invitation to present your lecture as part of my open studio here at Entrée. Thank you also Entrée and Randi Grovberger for hosting this event. My name is Magnhild Øen Nordahl, and the lecture this afternoon is part of a public program in connection to the final presentation of my artistic research PhD called Unmaking Abstractions. Before I introduce Felipe and his presentation, I would like to mention that this lecture is being recorded on Zoom, and that we will do a Q&A after Felipe's talk. So please write any questions you might have in the chat, and we'll go through them afterwards together with questions from people here in the gallery. Felipe Pena is a Brazilian curator based between Oslo and Rio de Janeiro, and he's the founding director of the gallery Cavallo in Rio. To introduce Felipe's lecture, I have brought with me this sculpture, these two sculptures actually, which Felipe bought for me in Brazil about a year ago. They are museum shop versions of one of my favorite pieces of Lygia Clark in the Bichos series. And in his lecture, Felipe will speak about Lygia Clark and the neo-concrete movement, focusing on its participatory approach and relation to modernism in Brazil in the 1950s. Felipe will consider how their legacy is affecting art and architecture in Latin America today. And with that, I'll pass on the word to you, Felipe.
Thank you, Magnhild. Hello, everyone. So I'm gonna mostly talk about Lygia Clark, which is a Brazilian artist, probably the most influential Brazilian artist we have. She began her work in the 40s, and her work is sort of a transition between this very modern thinking of abstract painting to a more postmodern work relating to the body, to participatory art. You can see her work in the biggest museums in the world, like MoMA, like Pompidou, Reina Sofia, and yeah. So, but I wanted to talk about her, like starting from sort of anecdote that happened when I was an art student about 12 years ago or so. When I was in college, reading international texts, and so there was this book of relational aesthetics, right, written by Nicolas Bourriot in the 90s, and he talks a lot about the aesthetics, like the works of artists such as Rickert Tiravania, of Felix González Torres, and how they invited the public in, and in their own work, this generation of European artists from the 90s. And this to me was a bit, everything that I was reading there, everything that I was seeing, it was very familiar because I grew up in Brazil with this sort of history and this sort of connection between art and participation of the audience. And so, but it bugged my mind that he actually never mentioned anything about it, right? So by the time he was sort of a young writer and curator, he was 33, and being a French curator, it sort of surprised me that he never acknowledged Lygia Clark, for example, who lived in Paris for so many years and was a professor at the academy there. So he actually went to Brazil about a year after I read his book, and people were making questions like why he didn't include, and he just said, "Oh, I just didn't know." And to me it was such a surprise because Lygia Clark is perhaps the household name in Brazil, and how can he not know of her work at the time when talking about those subjects? But yeah, but so I guess that's why it's sort of important to me to talk about non-Western art history more. And yeah, I think her work talks great about this. So, but I want to do a quick introduction on what Brazil was in the first half of the 20th century. So, and talk a bit about Brazil. This is the current population demographics. Like Brazil is the only Portuguese-speaking country. Most of its population are on the Atlantic side of the continent, while most of the Spanish-speaking population are on the opposite end, which I'm saying because I want to acknowledge how Brazil is sort of a country that is a bit alone in Latin America and perhaps the world. We are separated by a whole continent by most of our neighbors. We don't speak the language. There are a lot of connections between those countries, but there's also like a very inside art scene that yeah, that just relates to itself. And perhaps that's the reason that is not more acknowledged abroad. Inside Brazil, you have like the two biggest cities are Rio and its neighbor São Paulo. And those are sort of like antagonistic cities. I come from Rio, right? That is a city that is more linked to with beaches and natures, and while São Paulo, it's more connected to industrial background. I'm just saying this is perhaps very basic, but just to state the differences that I think it translates later in how those artists works. So in Rio, for example, you have you have much more like a beach culture, and so culture connecting to the body, and it's a bit perhaps like in other countries like New York and Los Angeles, this dichotomy that is very simplistic, but I think it helps you to understand the general feeling, right? So by that time, Brazil was by the first half of the 20th century, Brazil was passing through this big industrial revolution that that was a bit after Europe. It was some 3 decades perhaps after Europe. And after like the World War I and World War II, it was rising as one of the most, the biggest growing economies. So there was a general feeling of positivity in the early 50s, which is when the work of Lygia Clark started. And I think it's important to say that because it also soon things are going to change a lot politically there. There's going to be a dictatorship in the 60s and so, and I think her work also changes a lot after this. So the concrete movement, I'm not gonna show you a lot of pictures of like concrete artists because I think it's gonna deviate a bit of the what I think is the most interesting of her work and of the work made in that decade. But for example, in the 50s, the two big museums were opening in Brazil. That is the Modern Art Museum of Rio. This is the Modern Art Museum of São Paulo. The São Paulo Biennial was starting, so it was the second biennial in the world. And this modernist architecture was being a big hit, right? So houses that were like built like big pavilions with only windows, no walls, almost were the main way that architecture was being done at that moment. So this is a building at Rio of Gustavo Capanema, which is the culture minister, and this sort of buildings. And at the time, Brazil was the capital of Rio was the capital of Brazil, right? So that's when Lygia Clark moves to Rio, and she starts sort of late in her career for today's standards, perhaps. She was 27 at the time, and she had 3 kids. She comes from a sort of wealthy family, but still very challenging as a woman to start there. And she started mainly as an abstract painter, right? Doing very geometrical works and doing this sort of paintings. Just one second. I'm gonna stop share. Sorry. So this sort of practice of Lygia suddenly changes in the late 50s. I'm having trouble a bit coming back. Where are you? Just one second. I'm gonna share the screen. But at the end of the 50s, her work began to be a bit more sculpture-like. This, for example, is a piece called Cocoon. It's a folded aluminum painting or sculpture, if you like. It's a wall sculpture, but it's made of those folds, and these are the predecessors of her most famous works that are called bichos, which translates to something like beasts or cocoon or like creatures or animals or so, that you can see over there in the table, right? So these are foldable, articulatable pieces that any visitor can touch and try to change it. But there's also some resistance from its part. some are small as the ones on the table, some are almost like the size of a person. And yeah, and these are one of her seminal works, because it is those sculptures that are not made for like contemplation only. Those are only active if people are actually participating in the process of mounting, and so otherwise they can become just plain and fall. And this is, for example, an exhibition, but there is a lot of there's a conservational problem, of course, talking about those works that nowadays are worth millions. And many times in exhibitions you see something like this, like replicas that are displayed for the audience to engage with, and the works itself sort of protected by the audience and untouchable, which is always a bit of a problem for conceptual wise, right? Because those were works that were made to be played with and to be part of conversation with the audience, right? So Lygia slowly starts to call herself more like a propository, like she gives propositions more than make art itself. So, but what I think is one of the most interesting things is how this is a movement that that starts before some of the most well-known arts, like minimal art in the United States. Like some of the works deal with pop art as well, but I'm gonna try to show here. So she's doing this research along with a group of artists, and I'm gonna mention just two of them because I think those two became the highest names in the new concrete movement. Elliot Sika, which is also starts more or less like a painter, but by the end of the 50s starts doing big installations and trying to break the plane of and inviting like the body inside of those paintings. So those are big color fields that he's done at the same time of that Lygia is starting those beasts. These is a installation by him called Tropicalia, which is a I'm sorry, which is a big installation with poetry inside, with those fields of color that you can come inside with plants. And there was here, for example, I don't know if you can see like a cage with birds. And this was also installed in a retrospective by him in Tate, but the birds were not able to come. There were sort of a lot of protests for the, how do you say, these tropical birds to be able to see the visitors, and they are singing, and so yeah, this was forbidden. Parallel to this, the third artist that I think is also one of the main artist on this group is Lygia Clark, also doing big installation of works, participatory, that invites like the community to come and see this work called Divisor, where like people just stuck their heads off and becomes a big protest and a big play. It's a work that is being recreated several times after her death, and so but so these were sort of like the things were being done in the early 60s and late 50s in Brazil, that I think it's very new to art history itself. For example, this is a work that is a sensorial work that people would take the dropper, right, and put a little drop in their mouth, and then there's different tastes, and each different color has a different taste, but also, yeah. So the visitors will be engaging in this sort of participatory approach, like. And so I want to talk more about the bichos, the relation with architecture that they have. Lygia, in the beginning, also did some studies where she put like a little figure, and as a hint that it also had a lot to do with the architecture itself, even though it's usually a human scale. She gives this indication that it could be made giant, and so those are some works that were made after her death. This is a huge, like several tons installation at Henry Museum. This is one that went to an art fair, which I think it's actually, those are very strange, a bit like monstrous, and not in the best ways, but it just tells a lot about this feeling of like project and plan, that it was the general feeling, I guess, in Brazil in the 1950s. Right there was the capital was moving to Brasilia, so a whole city was built out of nowhere, and a city with like that you could only access by car, and with like buildings that were almost futuristic with shapes, and art in that sense was, or more specific, painting was totally being abandoned by architecture, right? So those big open plans and big windows where gardens could be inside, and so were not invited to those kind of works. And therefore, participatory works and works that were made on the street itself were a way of provoking this idea of geometry. And so I think what is the most interesting about Brazil's or Latin America history with geometric abstraction is that is made with a political setting always. So it is not only abstraction per se, and perhaps it's one of the reasons that those artists were inviting more and more the body and the viewer. Like Elliot Sika, for example, the artist that I just mentioned, had some sort of overall guide for what he thinks neo-concrete work should be. And it says like it has to come from a constructivist will, but also has to take a stand on a political, social, or ethical issue. And when I say this, it's like he's, for example, inviting samba dancers to create their own works that they can wear, and they are only activated by dance. And so in his case, he does a big event at the Modern Art Museum of Rio, and with samba dancers that were mainly Black, and they are all forbidden to enter the museum. So that's a bit of the clash where he's using abstract art to create these situations, these friction situations, I think. And that's where it is interesting. Lygia, on the other hand, she becomes more and more interested in therapeutical approaches. So her work becomes something like those soft works, right, that were made in the early 60s, and that I think resembles a lot works by Robert Morris, for example, those felt pieces that were made in the early 70s. But slowly she goes more to like works like Will You Too, the I and the You, where like instead of like these beautifully polished aluminum pieces, she makes like this strangely sealed like pieces of clothing that are put together, and they're colorful, where like you have two participants that has to take in, and in her proposition it should be a man and a woman, but the man would wear what you call like a woman's suit, and the woman would call a masculine suit, and they would engage in a series of like acts and proposals for touching themselves and dealing themselves. This is, for example, another work by her called Googles, like glasses. There are glasses with mirrors that can be that turns, so you see your own eye with the eye of the other person. And this is both a work with two people and a work that is just you and the reflection of your eyes and other parts of your body and these visions. So her work slowly starts to go towards something that is more precarious maybe, but also dealing a lot with the body. And in her late career, she becomes something closer to a therapeutical artist, or like she does more therapy and abandons more and more her position of art as intended by then, but I think what she was doing was very artistic as well. She does these sessions with people that suffers from like neuroses that are on the verge of like a breakdown, and there's a lot of objects that would touch the skin and relate to the body as a way of curing people somehow, always very like linked to other therapies. And so I think Brazil has also a very big history of artists that are either in mental institutions and in the position of patients or doctors that are doing experimental experimentations like Lygia, right? And her work can be like in these individual sessions, but it can also be something more collective. This is a work that I want to show called drew, I think it would be the best translation, where people would put lines in their mouths and then would slowly cover someone with their saliva, this line with saliva, this warm line. Is not very corona friendly, I think, but I wanted to show you the video of this this piece. I don't know if let me get the link. Because this is a work in the end of her career, and I think it's perhaps one of her most iconic works. Let me share this. You sure? Can you see the video? I'm not even gonna play the music, but those are small, how they call it, reels, right? That you put in your mouth with the lines, and then people slowly cover the body of a participant with this mixture of line and saliva and use, and anthropophagy in Brazil is, you know what it is, right? It has to do with cannibalism. So it is something that was done by several tribes of indigenous, and it became a political point of like being a country in the periphery of the world, like receiving those imperialist informations and images. So the point was like to take art from other people and to make it your own, right? So to make it but this is the sort of experience she was doing in the end of her career. Can you stop sharing? There's this installation by her in the late 60s that is called A Casa e o Corpo as well. And it's also an installation linked to the birth of a human being, of an individual. So it is, I'm gonna play it. This is the setting at MoMA right now, but it's a big installation where you can enter, you can have like, you can feel like the evolution process, so she says, and you can pass through like different stages until being sort of born or expelled, she says. So it is this feeling of mutating, of nurturing and being like almost like a fetus. And yeah, and it's interesting to see how complementary to her best friend Elliot Sika at the time that was doing those much more political on your face, like writing statements and dealing with marginal artists and marginal people actually. But she's building this work by that is very intimate. Yeah, until she ends her career in this with this phase that she calls like structuration of the self in English, right? So this idea of relating to be able to deal with the I. Yeah. Hi. So can we engage more in a conversation, I guess, right now? And
Great, thank you so much. So much, Felipe. It's always a bit difficult to transition between the sound online and in here, but
yeah, I'm getting a lot
Andreas,
of.
could you do me a favor and switch on the light here, and then Felipe will see us a bit better. Thank you so much for your lecture, Felipe, and thank you so much for not, yeah. And thank you for pulling that off, even if your computer crashed, you know.
Yeah, I'm having a lot of.
So you had to do everything again, super quick. But that was really nice, and I appreciate your contextualization and telling us about Brazil and the geography and letting us know that part a little bit. Are there any questions on Zoom? that we can start with, or should we start here? No Zoom questions. Does anyone here want to begin asking? No? I have a question for you, Felipe, that I can start with.
Yes, please.
Because you work as a curator in Brazil, and you're based between Norway and Rio. And I was wondering, with this legacy of neo-concrete art movement, which you have showed how it is a very influential and important art movement in Brazilian art history, can that be detected in contemporary art in Brazil today? Are there many contemporary artists working along the lines of this tradition?
Yes, no, for sure. I think it's one of the movements that is both shown a lot in schools and universities, but there is a tradition of artists working either with participatory art or like with geometrical art, but also changing it in that way, right? So I think works, for example, like Ernesto Neto, which is a big name internationally as well. It's perhaps the most obvious continuation of Lygia Clark's work. He's doing also a lot of sensorial works, inviting the audience itself in colorful installations. But I think there is a younger generation that is either dealing with her idea of healing socially and healing internally, that I think you can see a lot. I think one of my current favorite young artists is called Castiel Vitorino. She's a trans Black artist from the outskirts of Rio and from a neighbor state, I think. And she's, for example, doing a lot of rituals about colonization itself. So this would differ a bit from Lygia Clark, but I think there's an obvious link. There are many artists that reference directly her works, and so it's a bit, I feel like Munch can be in Norway, like where so many artists feel the need to address constantly. But I think many are doing like interesting continuations on her work without necessarily citating her. Yeah, I'd like to show maybe some examples, but I'm just gonna free flow then, right? So I'm gonna share the screen. I think Renata Lucas, for example, is an artist that comes from these traditions, also dealing with mostly with architecture, but also inviting the public. She does like big installations. She was like, this is probably in Venice, and so and then there are works, for example, as perhaps Felipe Cohen, or so there are more geometrical. There has to be a bit more with the previous concrete part of her movement. And so I mentioned before Ernesto Neto. Also huge artist, and yeah, perhaps Brazil's biggest artists right now, I would say. But all those, I think, are like unfoldings of questions that Lygia started somehow. And that's where this idea of Brazil she was building so much of what was Brazilian art. But those are just some of my takes.
Hello.
Hello.
Hey, Felipe. I just posted a long question to you that I will pose again. So can you hear me?
Yes, yes,
Yeah.
please.
Thank you very much. This is super great to have you open up Lygia's practice and also the context. And I had a question. I'm curious about the end of her work as you're talking about it moving out of into this therapeutic realm and a little bit out of maybe a more or kind of artistic aesthetic formal mechanisms and relational mechanisms, how she dealt with the institutional context, if she was still happy for it to be seen in galleries and museums or kind of opened up and shared there, or if she also shifted the activities into a more therapeutic context altogether, how she was relating to this art world herself.
Yeah, I think. Yeah, I think
historically, I guess it's been taken up and retold and elevated in these institutions, but how she was thinking about that movement, because it's quite radical how it really shifted. Yeah.
Yeah, I think she slowly begins to do those sessions more and more. And for example, her retrospective at MoMA was called The Abandon of Art, right? So there was this idea of she was moving less and less to this position of an artist, but until the end of her career, she was still doing like museum pieces. And so I think it was a practice that it just informed her work more and more. And it is still her work. Like this separation of art and life was her main reason, like to work, I guess, to erase this separation slowly. But she was still very accepted to the end of her life as an artist. But it still poses difficult questions, like to curatorship and to museology, how to treat those things. She didn't, for example, made a lot of video works showing those practice. It was mainly secret and personal sessions that was for like the audience of one. And perhaps that's something that she intended all of her life, like to do works for as conversation pieces, right?
I'll jump in with a question, responding to that a little bit. Because one of the things that made me very interested in the art of the neo-concrete movement, and especially Lygia Clark in this Bichos series, is how, when I look at them, well, when you brought me the models, I was for the first time able to actually interact with them the way that they're supposed to be. It seemed to me that they were made with the intention to invite the art viewer into a process that is similar to how the artist works in the studio. For example, with the Bichos that we have the models of here, I can imagine these as being first made as test objects that she would have in the studio to to try and find a shape for a public sculpture or a piece of
Mm-hmm.
architecture or a sculpture. And you know, maybe the hinges were a piece of tape first, or they were there for like the practical. I mean, I'm speculating now, but this is how I met her work first, and I thought about it as this. And that when she invites the viewer to, when she puts hinges on the work and she invites the viewer to engage with it, this is like inviting the viewer to kind of take part in her working process somehow. And that's something that I appreciate very much. And I felt, you know, familiar with from my own work. Is this wish to share with an audience part of the process that I am working with myself in the studio. And we discussed a little bit briefly about this approach earlier, and you said that this is an approach that you recognize in many of their works. So I was wondering, I was wondering if you have some examples of that where you have recognized that, or if you maybe just want to.
I think
we can continue
our
talk that we had earlier on, perhaps.
I think one of the interesting things, like when she's making, and so like she says herself, like, I'm just trying to make a bridge between what's later her therapeutic work. She calls like dealing with psychotic people as artists without work. It's a quote from her that I think it has to do a lot like with her idea of audience and creativity, and to and to give people a certain degree of liberty in her own works, right? But you were talking about the models, and so she was making like those cardboard models in her studios, and so before finishing, which I think is one of the I love the feeling of them, perhaps more than this hard steel. And for example, she has this series of works that is called matchbox structures. Also, there are a bit like buildings, a bit like sculptures. There's where you could play with the inside and the outside and create those small architecture like buildings, and that's one of the greatest points on her career, like this idea of like the inside and the outside goes in other works as well. Like, for example, there is this work that is one of the it's a proposition that usually people can play, and it's about this Mobius strip, right? So she cuts. The proposition is to cut and cut and cut and to make it more infinite, right? So the Mobius strip, you probably know what it is this piece of ribbon that is twisted in a way that there's no inside or outside, right? So because of this little turn that is made, so it represents many times like this idea of infinity, and she starts cutting it, or the audience starts cutting it, until the work dissolves completely. And this is just one of her propositions, but that I think it has to do with both the idea of disappearance that ironically her own oeuvre had at some point, but also the idea of like engaging to the audience. Does that somehow answer this?
Yes, thank you, Felipe. Another question here by Sissel. Another Sissel, Norwegian Sissel this time.
Hello, Felipe.
Hello.
I hope you hear me.
Yes.
It's on.
Hey,
I wonder
yes.
if you could say something more about her relationship with the audience, since it seems like that is also one of the turning points in how she develops her work. Could you extend that a little bit?
I can extend that. I think one of the big differences to make is that what she does is not a performance, in the sense that she's not presenting her body as something that has to be part of the work. So her work with the audience is basically proposing some piece, some movement, and absenting her own body from it, and perhaps her own position as an artist, right? So you will rarely see her engaging perhaps with someone directly, perhaps only in her more therapeutical sessions. But it's a series of proposals that she usually makes.
I also had a question about the shift in her practice, because that came towards the end of her career when she moved into these therapeutical sessions, I guess. Was she active in Brazil at the time, or is this when she was abroad? I'm just wondering if the military coup in Brazil, in the late 60s, in any way, if her work was responding to the situation in your country at the time.
Yeah. So she moves to Paris twice in her life. One in the beginning of her career, and then she studies with like painters as Sléger, and so. And then after the coup, she moves to Paris for a while, but for some years, she starts giving classes at the university. But she comes back by the end of her life, and that's where she mostly does these therapeutical works. So all this was during a dictatorship that lasted from 1964 to 88, so 24 years or so. And she's most of the time in Brazil somehow.
Okay, thank you so much, Felipe.
Mm-hmm.
Did I forget it? No. Yes. Thanks so much for answering our questions and for giving this great lecture on Lygia Clark and the neo-concrete movement. As I've told you, but I haven't told people here, she has been an inspiration in my PhD project Unmaking Abstractions. And to me, it's been very interesting to look at this movement and the legacy and the participatory elements of it in relation to 3D modeling technology and the use of these tools. So for me, it was a really, really great contribution to be able to have this lecture by you here today. Yes, to make a bridge or a connection from my project to an art historical movement that has been important for me. So thank you so much for calling in from Rio and sharing this lecture with us here this afternoon. And I hope you have a great weekend.
Yeah, I wish I could be there in person, and I got a bit stressed with all the Zoom problems and so. But thank you for inviting me. And
yeah, thank you so much, Felipe. It was great to have you with us. Okay, Bye-bye.
Bye bye.